but he's also super involved in AIAA as well as the National Institute of Aerospace, a bunch of other super cool aerospace things. He also, fun fact, was my high school swim coach. So very cool over here. Next week, we've got no meeting. We'll have a week off, but coming up in March, ooh, I've got a bullet missing, but we've got Navigator at Cherry Point coming back again to recruit for the summer. We've got Dr. Berg, who's an MAE professor, who is our, I guess he's an intro to aero professor now, but he also worked at SpaceX, as well as Eric Jacuzzi, who works for NASCAR. So that should be super cool. And additionally, as you guys realize, or I guess it's very common, oh no, my NASCAR symbol's gone too. We have our QR code for the attendance, and I believe Josh just went ahead and put that in the chat. So if you guys can go ahead and scan that or click the link and sign in there, you guys can get attendance for today. And that being said, I'll go ahead and have Coach Bob start speaking. I'm going to start getting off of my shared screen. Ta-da! And yep, the floor is yours.
All right, stand by. I'm going to share my screen.
We can see it.
Is that working?
Yep.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to move this over. Well, I can't move it over to the other screen. Okay, so I may look off to one side because I've got two screens here, and I could move the camera. Watch this. There, I just moved the camera over to the other screen. So good evening. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Bob Lindberg. I've been in the aerospace business for 40 some years, and I've done many talks with aerospace or AIAA chapters and other similar organizations. And my challenge is always, what do I talk about? Because I've done a lot of things, and you're going to hear about that a little bit later. I've done a lot of different things in my career. But one of the things that I'm involved in right now that I am particularly enjoying, and it's actually the one thing I do that I don't get paid for, is I'm involved in a very small, very focused community dealing with planetary protection. You may have encountered this already, or maybe not. It sometimes gets confused with planetary defense. Planetary defense is defending the planet from killer asteroids. That's not what we're talking about here. Planetary protection is something that goes back to the 1960s, so near the beginning of the space program. And it has to do with forward and backward biological contamination of worlds that we visit. So think about it as a discipline within solar system exploration. It's exclusive to solar system exploration as opposed to other parts of space exploration. And we focus on both protecting the places where we go and protecting the Earth. If you've ever read Michael Crichton's Andromeda Strain, the story of a bug that's brought from space to Earth that mutates and creates a pandemic and so on. That's the problem of backward planetary protection, or protecting against backward contamination. So with that, let me jump into it a little bit and tell you where it comes from. We start with interestingly enough, the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty was signed in 1967, and there are a number of articles in this treaty, but Article number 9, which is the one that is near and dear to everybody in the planetary protection community, says that the parties to the treaty shall pursue studies of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. Remember, this was as we were getting ready to go to the moon with humans, but we had already been to the moon and we have flown past several planets by this point, and conduct exploration of them so as to avoid their harmful contamination and also adverse changes in the environment of the Earth resulting from the introduction of extraterrestrial matter, and where necessary shall adopt appropriate measures for this purpose. So there you see right away in 1967, they were worrying about two things: avoid harmful contamination, that's forward contamination or forward planetary protection, and adverse changes to the environment of Earth, backward contamination or backward planetary protection. The term planetary protection dates to actually 1966 and is traceable to an article written by Carl Sagan and two of his colleagues that established the basis for worrying about what's the possibility. You know, they were having the philosophical discussion of what's the possibility that we might find life in the solar system, and then what's the risk that we might confound that science by contaminating where we go. So that was the motivation behind it. So this is something that is international, and there is a whole international community that's involved in it. There's another article that we're going to get back to at the end of this presentation called Article 6, and that has to do with the activities of non-governmental entities in outer space. Now, in 1967, there weren't any non-governmental entities active in outer space, and in fact, until about the year 2000, there wasn't anybody contemplating being a non-governmental entity acting in outer space for planetary exploration, at least. So now all of a sudden this has come to the forefront, both for robotic missions and for human missions. And we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of Article 6 when we get to the end of it. I'm going to march through these slides, and please ask a question if I'm not clear on something, but if you want to go exploring down any of the avenues further, we'll do that at the end of the talk. So forward and backward, forward planetary protection, backward planetary protection, we've already introduced this. So what do you need to do? Well, if you're going to take a Viking lander to Mars, and Viking was the first successful landing on Mars back in the 1970s, they recognized that Mars had the potential to have either evidence of extinct life or possibly even support extant life. And so we didn't want to contaminate the surface of Mars with something that we brought there that might confound the efforts to search for evidence of, in particular, extinct life on Mars. Now, Viking actually had a sensor that was looking for evidence that is telltale signs or signatures of extant life as well. So they were thinking both extant and extinct life on Mars when they first sent Viking. The way they treated Viking was what they called dry heat bioburden reduction, or DHMR, microbial reduction. And people call it sterilization, but sterilization is an absolute term, and this is not absolute. This is reducing the bioburden on the spacecraft down to some level that statistically would give you confidence that you wouldn't likely contaminate the surface. So it's not completely eliminating organisms on the spacecraft. But if you combine cleaning of the spacecraft in one of a variety of methods, which we'll talk about in a bit, together with the cold environment, the vacuum environment, and in particular the radiation environment that the spacecraft experiences in the transit from Earth to Mars, then you can add factors on top of factors and get to a reduction in viable organisms on the spacecraft to something that's acceptable. So the Outer Space Treaty, interestingly, talked about harmful contamination. They didn't say prevent all contamination. They said prevent harmful contamination. What we're primarily concerned with is the transport of two things: viable Earth organisms that can survive the trip from Earth to Mars or wherever we're going, and can replicate when they get there. So it has to be someplace where there's an environment that would be supportive of the replication of a terrestrial microorganism. And then second, we're also worried about organic materials that may not be living things, but may be organic materials that if we later detected them, would they confuse us as to whether they were organic materials that were found on Mars or whatever our destination is, or are they organic materials that we brought there? Now that can mean a lot of things, and we deal with organic materials in spacecraft design quite often because organic materials can include things like seals and greases and other things that go into the building of a spacecraft that can outgas and leave deposits of organic material on other surfaces once they get into orbit, out into the vacuum of space. So we're worried about both, but worried for different reasons. But we don't want to start colonies of Earth organisms on Mars or wherever else we're going that could support it. And we don't want organic materials deposited there that we then discover and say, hey, we found evidence of organic materials on Mars. Did we bring it there? Is it us? Or is it something that's unique to Mars? But for practical reasons, because there are only a few places where we can look for extant or extinct life, that is, places that could support life today or could have supported life in the past, and for Mars, it's primarily in the past, we worry about Mars and Europa and Enceladus as those places that we have to provide, for which we have to provide the highest protection. Lesser concern with going to the moon, for example, because if we find a Earth organism on the moon, we're going to be pretty certain that we brought it there, because Earth organisms will not survive on the moon. There isn't sufficient water at a level of water activity, meaning liquid water, that would support life. And there isn't an atmosphere that would support life. So going to an asteroid, not really concerned. Going to Mercury, too hot, not really concerned. Going to the moon, well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a new concern that might require a focus on planetary protection for the moon, but it's a little bit different than what we're talking about right here. And we'll get to that in a future slide. So what I described to you is a challenge that can be met by cleaning what we take to these various places. So up until the time of the Curiosity rover on Mars in the early part of this decade, there'd never been a concern about planetary protection once you launched a mission. That is, you would set up the standards for planetary protection of a given mission, like Viking or Pathfinder or Sojourner, and you would implement your planetary protection protocols, and you would clean your surfaces, and you would measure the cleanliness of your surfaces, and then you would launch the vehicle, and that would be it. You would check the box and say, I did everything I needed to do before launch to make sure it was clean enough that I don't have to worry. All of a sudden at Mars, with Curiosity, in 2013, Curiosity detected methane spikes in the Martian atmosphere. Now, an organic chemist would tell you that methane can be generated often by biotic processes, but can also be generated by abiotic processes. So methane might be a signature for life. It's not definitely a signature for life, but it's something that we would want to pay attention to. Well, it turned out that the detection of the methane spikes was something that might tell us that we were getting close to what we call a special region on Mars, which is a region that has the environment that could potentially support life. So it would have liquid water and enough pressure and enough protection from radiation that it might be a location that could support and sustain life. And if we were going to get to what we call a special region, Curiosity was not cleaned well enough to approach a special region. And so we would have to steer away from it. If we thought that we were coming close to it, we would want to be cautious. But in 2013, there was no protocol for dealing with planetary protection during surface operations on Mars. So for the first time, and as a result of a subcommittee that I used to chair that advised NASA on these concerns, I used to chair something called the Planetary Protection Subcommittee of the NASA Advisory Council. Our committee went back to NASA and said, look, you've detected methane on Mars. That planetary protection might be an important consideration in what you do next after you discover that. And it wasn't, but planetary protection folks were not involved in the decision making or the planning for the surface operations. And so NASA changed their processes. And now planetary protection is taken into consideration as a routine part of daily operations on Mars for the rovers that are still operating there, something that had not been considered before. So what do we have in the future? Well, we've got Europa Clipper coming up, going to Europa. It's actually, it's not going to orbit Europa. It's actually a really neat design if you care about orbital mechanics. It's designed to orbit Jupiter and make 45 consecutive close passes over Europa. And they've worked out the phasing of it so that it should map a large percentage of the surface of Europa by doing basically flybys, repeated flybys of Europa at lower total energy required than having to decelerate and go into orbit around Europa to take the same data. So it's fun from an orbital mechanics standpoint, which is something I used to be involved in. I found it interesting. But Europa is an interesting place. If you remember 2001, The Space Odyssey, Europa was the one thing that humans should never go. And there was actually a very good reason for that. Europa has a solid global ice crust, and underneath it, a salt ocean. And that ocean is in contact with the mantle beneath it. So as a result, there is the potential that that ocean, which is warmed by geothermal energy and tidal energy, a significant tidal energy at Jupiter, that ocean actually could have supported or could support the origin of life. And one of the great questions is, if we ever get to the ocean under this thick ice crust on Europa, would we find life there already? And there are concepts for future missions that would drill through the ice and float a submarine in that ocean on Europa to look for that. Fascinating stuff. But now we have a real concern, because Now we've got the potential, if we took a submarine and dropped it into that ocean and it had Earth microbes on it that were placed in an environment where they could thrive, water and sufficient energy to and nutrients to grow, we might contaminate the entire moon, not just a local area, but the transport through that global ocean could be significant. So we really need to think about how we approach what are called the icy moons or the icy worlds in our solar system. Europa is one of the 4 large moons of Jupiter. Another, much smaller, is Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, a small moon of Saturn, but a moon that has that we've already photographed ice plumes 200 kilometers high over its surface. So it's actually spouting water. The pictures of Enceladus are pretty remarkable. So those are 2 places in addition to Mars that we want to protect for entirely different reasons than the reasons for protecting Mars. One's a terrestrial planet. These are not. These are ocean worlds. And the ocean worlds become a really interesting place to potentially look for extant life and perhaps understand the origin of life. Now let's shift from forward contamination to back contamination. And now we go back in time. The first challenges with backward contamination was Apollo 11. And actually, at that time, planetary protection was called planetary quarantine. And if you've ever seen the pictures, this is a President Nixon visiting the Apollo 11 crew in the quarantine facility aboard the USS Hornet aircraft carrier back in 1969 when they returned from the moon. They isolated them for a period of weeks in what looks like and actually was an Airstream trailer that they lived in. But they were ushered in there in suits, and then the technicians stepped out, and they stayed in there making sure that they didn't bring any bugs back from Mars that they should be concerned about. And the rocks that they brought back from Mars were likewise quarantined until we gained confidence that that the moon, which many people suspected, was not a place that could harbor extant life. And so subsequent Apollo missions, Apollo 12, 14, and so on, did not have to follow these quarantine protocols. But this is where it started. This was the first time that we dealt with the question of backward contamination. And 1969, we already had the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, so we already had the obligation the international obligation to our partners to protect the Earth from harmful contamination. The backward contamination story today is interesting, and let's move from human missions to robotic missions, back to robotic missions again. Perseverance, which should land on Thursday at Mars. You guys are following this? I don't know whether you are. If you're aero guys, you're not following this. The space folks of you are following this, I'm sure. So Perseverance lands on Friday or on Thursday. And it is designed for the first time to collect soil and rock samples that will be cached and returned on a future Mars mission. And that future Mars mission will probably be international. There's a joint NASA-ESA concept right now, European Space Agency, NASA mission, to bring the samples back. So you can't do it all in one mission. So they're going to collect them on this mission, bring it back on a subsequent mission. And not very much, half a kilogram of total samples in 36 or 39 test tubes, about yay big, about the size of test tubes, about the size of a small cigar. But the purpose for collecting those samples is to search for signs of ancient microbial life in the rocks on Mars. The challenges of bringing it back are that the first step in the process is when you leave Mars, you've got your sample contained inside this test tube, metal container, but the outside of that container has been exposed to the Martian atmosphere. So if you've got extant life that you're bringing back, it could be on the outside of the container. So somehow you've got to break the chain of contact with the Martian environment and make sure that the outside of that container is sterile, and the inside and the Martian environment characteristics that you're bringing back are only on the inside of that container. Then you've got to mitigate the risk of crashing on Earth. If you come back, you've got to do your planning such that your trajectory planning such that you reduce significantly the potential that a bad day doesn't result in the vehicle that's bringing the sample back actually coming back in a hard landing rather than a planned landing, because that could then distribute what's inside those containers and they could end up outside those containers. And part of that mitigation is the integrity of the containers themselves and what they can withstand. Then you got to put those containers somewhere before you open them up. And today our thinking, and for the last 20 years, because we've been talking about this for 20 years now, we've been talking about bringing samples back from Mars for 20 years, that we're going to likely need a containment facility that is similar to or has the characteristics of a biosafety level 4 facility. These are the facilities where people today do experiments, research with Ebola and anthrax and other highly contagious phenomena. So we're going to need to contain it in those facilities. And then you have to start thinking about, okay, now if any mission like this is going to be likely an international mission, which means that our international partners are going to want to share in conducting the research. Everybody wants to be the first person to discover that unambiguous evidence of extinct life on Mars. And so we're going to have to share those samples with other researchers around the world. Well, how do we share those samples? Well, one of the things that we were talking about was before you take it out of the BSL-4 facility, the containment facility, you sterilize the sample itself. Forgive the clock, although it does tell me that I'm halfway through my talk. So we have to think about, and we haven't figured it out yet, are we going to share materials that are not sterilized, that still contain the potential to hold extant Martian organic material, or are we going to do enough science to convince ourselves that anything in the sample is not extant, it's extinct, in which case we can share the sample? How do we keep the sample clean so that when we pass it on to somebody else, they're not finding organic material that we contributed to the sample after the fact? And we have about a decade to get ready for this. So it's an interesting new problem that we haven't dealt with before, that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to plan for before we bring those samples back that Perseverance is now ready to land on Mars and collect. So we get wrapped up, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but we get wrapped up in categories. So the categories are specifically categories of missions. Each mission is designated a category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 mission. And these are international categories. There's some variation that occasionally occurs between NASA and the rest of the world but they're normally synced up after the fact. So if NASA changes something, they share it with the rest of the world, the rest of the community, and the rest of the community usually follows suit. Well, by the way, most of the protocols for planetary protection were developed in the US and shared with the rest of the world. There's some work that goes on in Europe now that contributes as well, but the majority of the work has been done in the United States. So Category 1 destinations are missions to places like the Sun and Mercury and Io. Anybody know why Io would be of no direct interest? It's the most volcanically active moon in our solar system. Also one of the 4 big moons of Jupiter. So those are places that are not of direct interest or understanding the process of chemical evolution or the origin of life. So we don't think we're going to find any evidence there that would help explain origins of life, so we're not going to worry about it. If we contaminate it, so what? We know that we brought it there. Category 2 is where there's only a remote chance that contamination could jeopardize future exploration. And right now, that's the moon, Venus, comets, and certain classes of asteroids. Category 3 and Category 4 both deal with places where there's significant chance that contamination could jeopardize future exploration. And we've already talked about Mars, Europa, and Enceladus. And right now, those are the only 3 places where we would have a mission that would be categorized as Category 3 or Category 4. Now, Category 3 is a standard that we set for orbiters and flybys of these planets. Why would we care about orbiters or flybys? Well, basically, we got to make them sure they're clean enough that if they crash, they wouldn't contaminate the environment. So we worry not just about intentional landing, but the potential for unintentional contact with the surface. And then Category 4 is landers, and on Mars, we get into even finer resolution. And for Mars missions, we have Category 4A, 4B, and 4C, depending upon first where we're going on Mars, whether we're going to be close to a special region that might support life, Earth life, and second, whether we're taking instruments that are trying to detect life. And if you're both going to a special region and trying to detect life, you're a Category 4C. If you're a rover that's just doing geology work, you're a 4A. And then Category 5 deals only with return missions and only with the return part of return missions. So Category 1, 2, 3, and 4 are concerned with forward contamination, and Category 5 is exclusive to backward contamination. And in Category 5, we have 2 different types of return missions. Unrestricted Earth return, where the bodies from which we're coming have no indigenous life forms. And then restricted, and those are missions from bodies that are deemed to be of significant interest to the process of chemical evolution or the origin of life. Notice we talk about not just life detection, but chemical evolution as well. And we're going to get into that in another slide or two. So we've talked a little bit about this. We've got to reduce the bioburden on the spacecraft. We've got to reduce the organic material and the microbes that are currently on the spacecraft. And how do we do that? Well, we start the very floor, the basics that all of them go through is that for all of these spacecraft, you typically assemble them in a Class 100 clean room. That's a pretty tight cleanliness level. To get anything better than it, the lower the number, the cleaner the environment. So a Class 10,000 clean room, you can set up a tent with some HEPA filters, and you can run and you do positive pressure so that the tent is higher pressure than the outside atmosphere. So the air is basically blowing out and it's coming in through HEPA filters, and you're good at 10,000. You can sometimes drive that down to, if you put solid walls on that, you can get that down to a class 1,000. Class 100 requires more cleaning than that and requires cleaning maintenance of the room. When you get down to class 10, you really can't make a whole room class 10. You're normally talking about class 10 is a clean bench and a hood over a bench inside a class 100 clean room. So I'm trying to get you there without giving you the technical specs of what a class 100 clean room is. But we're going to assemble it. If we're going to go to Mars, we're going to assemble it in a class 100 clean room, but that's not going to be enough. Class 100 clean room, by the way, requires full hood, booties. You don't have to cover your face, but you have to wear a mask if you have facial hair. So it's a pretty clean environment. Then we clean individual surfaces on the spacecraft with solvents. Then we might go through what Viking went through with dry heat microbial reduction, and that is heating the spacecraft for a period of hours to 114 C. But think about what your computer would look like if you put it in a oven at 114 degrees C for an hour. It's not a pretty picture. Most electronics that we fly on spacecraft today can't survive that environment. They typically, most microchips typically max out at about 60 degrees or 70 degrees C. That's their, they might have an operating limit of 60 degrees C and a non-operating limit of 70 degrees C, and they don't want to go beyond that. So I can't use DHMR if I'm going to use modern electronics to clean the whole spacecraft. So we're starting to look at other techniques that can be used as well. And that includes things called vapor phase hydrogen peroxide, where we mist the whole thing with hydrogen peroxide. Ethylene oxide is another potential cleaning agent. We can use passive UV radiation, which does really well for the surfaces that we can contact with the UV, but it doesn't get in the crevices that the UV can't reach. So we have to think about maybe doing that before we assemble the vehicle as opposed to afterwards, because we're not going to get that UV light inside the box or between the box and the deck that the box is mounted to, which might have microbes that are trapped between the two. Gamma radiation is another. Electron beams is being kicked around. It's not used yet. But you start to get the idea that we need to come up with strategies for how to clean these spacecraft so that we don't contaminate the environments that we go to. And then we do assays to determine spore counts. And these are actually swabs that are then cultured, and we look for spores that will culture, and we use those as surrogates for how clean the whole spacecraft is. So we can't find every microbe and there are many types of microbes that we can't detect with easy detection methods by doing an assay. But what we can do is we can say, okay, if we do an assay and we get only so many of this kind of contamination, we can make some assumptions about the total contamination of other types of microbes on the spacecraft. And so what we're normally looking for is spores, things that are in a dormant state that we can then culture. That's all I'm going to spend on how to clean spacecraft. You can do a whole lecture on, there are classes that are given just on this. But I wanted to give you a feel for it. One of the other questions that has recently come up, and this is actually the first report that's generated by the new committee that I'm on, is a question that NASA posed to our committee about how to protect, or whether we need to protect the permanently shadowed regions on the moon. are you folks familiar with the fact that the moon has craters at the poles that are permanently shadowed and have not seen sun for millions of years? You're aware of that. So when I was your age, and actually when I was twice your age, we didn't think the moon had any water on it at all. And then we came to learn that there were some telltale signatures of lunar ice that may be trapped in permanently shadowed regions on the moon and would not have, and because they're so cold, the water would not have sublimated even after millions of years. The moon has no atmosphere, and so it really can't hold water on the surface or water ice on the surface. It would just, it would sublimate and escape to space. And it does at the warmer latitudes of the moon. But at the coldest places on the moon, we're at something like 45 degrees Kelvin. We're really cold. This is some of the coldest places in our solar system. And they're believed to hold water ice and other volatiles that are trapped in those cold spots. In addition to water ice, we think that there could be ethanol, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, sulfur dioxide, formaldehyde. Each one of these has a specific temperature at which they would sublimate. And these, the coldest of these craters at the poles are cold enough that it would hold all of them. Where would they have come from? Well, they would have come from bombardments of the moon much earlier in the solar system's life, when there were lots of comets hitting the moon. We know that the age of most craters is pretty old. We know when most of the cratering was done on the moon, and that's when these would have been deposited. Well, they become now of interest to people who are trying to do prebiotic chemical evolution. That is, understanding what the early chemical evolution of the solar system was. So to the extent that some of the items that I've listed, ammonia and ethanol and formaldehyde, are organic materials, they might be evidence of what chemicals were around on Earth and on the moon at the time that life spontaneously arose on Earth. And so that chemical evolution might tell us more about the evolution of life on Earth. So you start with the chemical evolution of the solar system, and you move from there to the potential for the origin of life on Earth. So then the question for our committee was, what is the risk of contamination by the lunar missions that we're taking there today, and how can we protect the science? Well, initially, one would think logically that if you don't go to the pole, if you're like the lunar missions of the past that have landed at the low latitudes on the moon, that we're taking stuff to the moon, but we're not taking it to the regions at the poles where we might contaminate these permanently shadowed receptacles or deposits of organic materials and volatiles. And you say, well, somebody did a modeling last year of what happens to the exhaust of a rocket engine when it's used to descend to the surface. And what they were able to show was that the fact that the moon doesn't have any significant atmosphere actually results in that plume being distributed globally around the moon. And so some part of that plume, very small amounts, could deposit on the surface of these cold locations. And if they're cold enough, the coldness will hold them there and bind them to the region. And so we would have contaminated the surface of these cold deposits, even though we didn't land anywhere near it. So we took these questions up in the committee, and we started to examine these questions both from a quantitative and a qualitative standpoint to understand what's the real risk. And so there's a new report that actually came out in December that our committee put forward that raises some interesting questions and provides a few answers. I'm running a little bit late, but let me go back to that Article 6. We talked about non-state actors. What about commercial space exploration? Well, today we've got SpaceX talking about taking a Starship to Mars. There it is, landing on Mars. More significantly right now, we've got robotic missions by several companies that NASA's already bought rides on to go take scientific instruments to the moon. The interesting thing is all of the planetary protection that's been done in the United States has been implemented by NASA for NASA missions. ESA and JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and others all have their own planetary protection officer that does the same thing. There's a Committee on Space Research International that facilitates the international interaction on this. But the U.S. currently has no regulatory framework for assuring that non-governmental entities abide by the Outer Space Treaty. You go back to the words in the Outer Space Treaty, it falls to the nation state to assure that private actors who are citizens of that state adhere by the treaty. So U.S. has an obligation to make sure that SpaceX abides by planetary protection protocols, but there's nothing in the U.S. regulations to deal with that. So on December 30th, at the very end of the last administration, the National Space Council released a national strategy for planetary protection. And that strategy document, which you can download from the internet, sets timelines, pretty aggressive timelines, everything for the next 3 months to the next 12 months for getting some decisions on regulating these non-governmental entities. And here are the recommendations of that, or the requirements of that national strategy. So now the agencies have to go and develop this. But one of them is to develop a report reviewing the U.S. government payload review process. That's how does the government review the payloads from non-government actors? And then in the private sector involvement, develop a report on industry feedback and R&D partnership opportunities within 3 months, and then develop guidelines on the authorization and continuing supervision. That's specifically the words from the Outer Space Treaty on how to deal with, how to regulate non-state actors. So all of this is really focused, when you boil it down, to finding life beyond Earth, which is something that is a question that could sustain your entire career, and it has sustained my entire career. So I thought I'd finish right about here and ask for questions. And by the way, I don't have to stop at 7:30. I don't know, maybe Zoom will cut us off, but over to you.
Well, thank you for all of that information. It's certainly a topic we've not heard, at least since I've been in AIAA the last 3 years. So that is super interesting.
I'm glad you found it interesting. When I got involved in planetary protection about 12 years ago, it was because I was asked to serve on a committee, and I vaguely knew what it was, but I didn't know any of the details. Wow. And I found that there's probably 50 people in the world that could give this lecture, not more than that. Wow. There's about 50 people who really understand this stuff. So it's a very small community. And I know most of them. I have friends in France and friends in Austria and friends in Germany and friends in the Netherlands who are friends only because we share this passion for this question.
Wow, very interesting. I guess that being said, how like what type of people, I guess, are on the committee? Are they people who are mostly aerospace, or like how does that kind of work out in that sense?
I'm in the minority, having come from the aerospace design world.
Okay.
The the committee has organic chemists, astrobiologists. Astrobiology is actually the search for uh, life species that started somewhere else other than Earth. So it's a discipline that's in hunt of its first success. But there's a whole community of astrobiologists that are looking for ways to coming up with methodologies for looking for life. That doesn't have to do with SETI. It's not the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's a search for microbes. So it's looking for life in the rocks. And then there are people who are familiar with geology. A lot of people who are planetary science background. There's more scientists on the committee than there are engineers. But then there are several of us who have been involved in launch vehicle design, spacecraft design, planetary mission operations. We've got a couple people. JPL is the U.S. Center for Planetary Exploration, and we've got several people who are former JPL people. And then there's a fellow on the committee who is designing robotic robots to excavate the surface and that sort of thing. So it's a combination of scientists and engineers, but in the past, we've had, on the committee that I had that advised NASA, we had a lawyer who understood the Outer Space Treaty and was familiar with international space law. We had an ethicist. The ethicist was there he justified his existence of, he said, well, you guys are all arguing about what you're going to do when you detect life on Mars. He said, my question is, if you find life on Mars, should you tell anybody? And the ethics of for those of us who are in this field and technically savvy, we get really excited about the potential to discover life on other planets, life that started elsewhere. But it could disrupt society in major ways when you think about various cultures around the world and how they treat, the religious aspects of are we alone in the solar system and that sort of thing? Are we alone in the universe? So that it could raise interesting questions and cause a lot of consternation. So you got to think about how you're going to roll that out. So our ethicist was always, it was fun to have debates with the ethicist on our committee. Other questions?
I got a quick question for you, Dr. Lindberg. So how do you think the Space Force will play into this whole conversation?
So Space Force right now is focused exclusively on the Earth orbiting space environment, and so they're until or unless we start talking about taking military systems to the moon or to other planetary bodies in the solar system, it really is a footnote to what we're doing in planetary protection. If you started colonizing other worlds and then started militarizing those colonies, then it might become more relevant. It's a good question.
It's actually Josh's question, but I was just we were both pretty interested, so I asked for it. So thank you.
Yeah, good.
I have a quick question.
Anybody else?
Can
Chris.
I ask the question real quick? Okay, yeah. So what you're saying about like the regulation with industry seems like a very difficult challenge. When I first hear this, because I feel, is there like any pushback from industry? Because I would imagine it might be like if you're trying to set like a higher level of regulations for like cleanliness and things to prevent any kind of contaminants. Because I would imagine that one, it'd be very expensive to maintain clean rooms for some of these private companies that are wanting to go to space. And so I wonder if that's like a significant challenge to kind of enforce those policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take it a step further. If we're going to take humans to Mars, you're not going to leave the human biome behind.
Mm-hmm.
And there's you may not be aware of this, but there are actually more microbes in the human body than there are cells in the human body.
Yeah.
So you're inevitably going to take that contamination. Now I can contain that contamination inside a habitat or inside a spacesuit, but sooner or later that habitat or that spacesuit is going to vent into the atmosphere, and we're inevitably going to contaminate where we go. So we're going to have to start thinking about regions where humans can go that are permissible and won't contaminate the places where we still want to do science. We also need to think about doing as much of the science before the humans get there as possible, especially, and it's not all the science that you want to do on Mars. It's just the science associated with the search for life. But your other question is more generally and more immediately. Your question applies to the commercial folks trying to take landers to the moon. Yes, there is some pushback. The U.S. right now already licenses all launches from the U.S. And so I consult with a company called Firefly, and I'm helping them get their launch license. And that launch license process includes a payload review process. So that payload review is an interagency review that could involve other agencies and could focus on planetary protection as well as other questions. Today it does not, but at least there's a mechanism by which it could. So that's how you could get your regulatory leverage to actually influence what the private actors do. And then some of the questions that the strategy that I talked about, if I go back a couple slides, some of these questions, the question, this one on the U.S. government payload review process, and the third one on developing the guidelines on authorization and continuing supervision, that is all a result of the National Space Council recognizing that they've got to balance the desire to comply with the Outer Space Treaty with the commercial interests of these actors.
Okay.
Make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, no, that does make sense. In your answer to my question, it kind of one of the first things you said about trying to perform some of the scientific missions before humans ever arrive. It kind of brings a question to mind if, for instance, like the Perseverance rover, for example, is able to find like some kind of evidence of extinct life on Mars. Do you think that could make it more challenging to bring humans to Mars with that knowledge?
I think so. We've had that conversation as well. That's a really insightful question. I think that if we find incontrovertible evidence of extant life on Mars, we might decide that we should never go there.
Yeah, it's almost to be like a Pandora's box.
Well, and if you're a Star Trek fan, that's the Star Trek Prime Directive.
Yeah.
Right? Is that you should not adversely influence the places that you visit and the cultures you interact with. So I think you raise a really good question. Would discovery of extant life on Mars actually make human exploration of Mars more less attractive or more challenging, ethically more challenging.
Mhm.
Yes. Not the least, and that's putting aside the issue of, well, if I find extant life on Mars, then it means that I could. So, for example, if I find extant life on Mars, how do I do the quarantine on the backward contamination? How do I decide that I can actually bring a human back to Earth?
Mhm.
You know, or is it then by definition a one-way trip?
Mhm. That's very interesting. So I guess another question I have is, if we were planning to bring samples back from Mars, is there any kind of instruments or technology or any kind of practices we're planning to do before any kind of vehicle or sample leaves Mars to like clean it and kind of like try to desanitize it before ever even leaves the Martian surface? Because that seems like it could be another significant challenge.
Yeah. So we want to clean the outside of those test tubes, so that we make sure that there's not that we've broken the chain of connection with the Martian environment, but we don't want to sterilize what's in the tubes, because that might contaminate or confound our ability to scientifically explore what we're bringing back. So so that's why I talked about a BSL-4 facility, a facility where you can be, as a researcher investigator, can be on one side of a barrier and your sample be on the other side of a barrier, and you can interact with that barrier and do your research. Most of the instrumentation that we've kicked around the ideas of, well, could we bring the samples back to the International Space Station or to a base on the moon and examine them with instruments there, and then sterilize them and bring them back to Earth only after we've done the examination that we want to do to look for extant life. And that's been kicked around, but it's believed to be impractical for the most part, because the scientists who want to do the science to look for life want to use the instruments that are in their laboratory, not some dumbed down version of that instrument that we could qualify to take to space.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
All right. Well, I guess if we have no more questions, we can go ahead and close.
I wanted to
out.
ask another question too, but I wanted to give everyone else a chance if anyone else
Go
wanted to
for it,
ask something.
Kristen.
So, are there any like technologies in development that would allow us to have like higher quality safe rooms, or safe rooms that could provide like a higher cleanliness level? Because from like the things I've just read, that it's almost, there's a lot of limiting factors and a lot of effort that would take just to get like, let's say like a 500 level clean room. So I was just curious about that. Like any kind of
Yeah. So more specifically, there's research that is, well, there are advocates for increasing the budget, the NASA budget, for investigating cleaning methods, not so much making clean facilities, because we get down to much cleaner facilities when we're doing microchip fabrication, for example. Those are done in very clean facilities, and they're all done robotically. So you can clean them once and you don't have any humans wandering through the environment that's contaminating them. It's the humans that contaminate it. You know, if we could build just machines, we could keep them abiotic. We could eliminate all the organic material. But the focus of the research really is on examining some of those other cleaning techniques that are not yet approved, but have potential for solving some of the challenges associated with either keeping the spacecraft clean or cleaning the spacecraft well enough.
Okay, thank you.
I guess actually based off of that question, I know during Apollo, a lot of that stuff was held at Houston. but I
Yeah.
guess, is that like still the same type of place where it would be now, or have the locations moved when it comes to quarantine?
Well, so the stuff that we've brought back is the U.S. has brought stuff back from the moon. There's solar dust that the U.S. has brought back. That's solar system dust, and then there's samples from comets and asteroids that have been brought back by other countries. Probably the most successful of those is a mission called Hayabusa, which is a Japanese mission that was actually launched from Japan but landed in Australia, and they recovered it in the outback of Australia. Intentionally, they were partnered with the Australians to do that, and they brought back samples of a comet, I think. So to your question, where are the containment facilities today? The lunar rocks are still managed out of Johnson Space Center in Houston, and they're distributed around the world. The Japanese handle the distribution of their samples, and typically a science principal investigator who has an experiment that would bring something back from an asteroid or a comet would be responsible for managing the samples once they're returned. So those would, in the rare occasions, there have been several missions proposed, and those would be managed at the universities where the investigators are located.
Wow, interesting.
Or at the government lab where they're located.
Yeah.
So
makes sense.
where do we bring the Mars material back? The Mars, that'll probably be a political decision. That is, there'll be an investment in a new facility that has the characteristics of a BSL-4 facility, but also would allow our international investigators to come and visit. And so it would have to have there are a lot of features that would go into that.
Mhm.
And it would probably be a feather in the cap of any congressional representative to have it show up in his or her district. And so the funding for it will probably come attached to a designation of where it should go.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wow. Well, that'll be interesting to see how it pans out.
Yep, absolutely.
Wow.
The scientists don't care. They'll flock to wherever it is. So. Well, we didn't talk about AIAA, and we didn't talk about my career at all. But